Good evening. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house to be so kind to check your cell phones one last time before we begin. Putting them on silent is always appreciated. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference, and our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program this evening is Arthur Millick. Arthur is our Assistant Director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. He conducts research on America's founding principles and grand strategy and focuses on the tenets of American political tradition. Before joining us here, he was on and worked for the House Armed Services Committee as well as at the Hudson Institute. Please join me in welcoming Arthur Millick. Arthur?
Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Arthur Millick. I'm the Assistant Director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. And we're joined tonight by one of my favorite writers, Theodore Dalrymple. When I evoke his name, many look at me with eyes of recognition, confirming he numbers among their favorite writers as well. Others, who stare back with puzzlement, ask with their eyes, "What is a Dalrymple?" Tonight's event is about Dalrymple's new book, Admirable Evasions: How Psychology Undermines Morality. A close examination of modern psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience from the perspective of literature and philosophy is long overdue. The scope of modern psychology's influence is remarkable. Indeed, to what or to whom do we most turn to learn about what man is and what's good for him? What other authority in modern secular democracies is as widely presumed capable of addressing human happiness? And our predisposition towards it, not genetic, of course, but social, is on account of notions we hold onto for dear life, like equality, for example. Equality implies that all human beings are sovereign in their own judgment. That means we rarely take great individuals or traditions on their word. That is to say, we don't want to be ruled by human beings, but we can stomach abstract, seemingly non-human wisdom. Moreover, the fruits of natural science have been so thoroughly successful that it may seem that all things can be known through the scientific method, and all things can be fixed through its application, even human beings. The decline in religion and other traditions means psychology is left almost alone to comment on human wholeness, which is to say, human happiness. But when it turns to man, a strange picture arises. One half of the world is ill, and the other is mad, it sometimes pronounces. And the past, indeed all of history, can be accounted for as misdiagnosed illness. For example, Caesar was merely a megalomaniac. Psychology's fruits are not held privately by a few, but disseminated into the public. And their effects, as Dalrymple argues in his new book, range from the shocking to the amusing to the disenchanting. Unlike many, the facts of Dalrymple's biography suggest his life was guided by curiosity rather than social standing or other motives. He has traveled throughout the world as a doctor and writer. His travels took him to several dictatorial and communist regimes, presumably sometimes at the threat of his life. He has worked as a psychiatrist among inmates in British prisons, also presumably sometimes at threat of his life. On these and other experiences, he has written thousands of articles and numerous books. He is without doubt among the most graceful and astute writers around. After the talk, we'll have a Q&A session, and it'll be followed by a reception just down the hall here. Please help me welcome Theodore Dalrymple.
Thank you very much, Arthur. I should just say that perhaps the prisoners thought that I was more a threat to them than they were to me. First, I should like to thank the Heritage Foundation for having asked me for a second time. It's a great honour and pleasure, and it doesn't seem very long ago that I addressed the foundation for the first time, and it seems because it actually wasn't that long ago, actually. Well, 21 years ago, I wrote a piece in the City Journal that was titled "The Knife Went In." And it referred to a curious phenomenon that I'd noticed in the prison in which I worked. And that was that virtually all murderers who stabbed someone to death, said of the relevant moment, the knife went in. And I thought that this was a curious way of describing what had happened, implying as it did that the knife had a volition of its own, and that it was the knife that guided the hand rather than the hand that guided the knife. And my wife thought, who is also a doctor, thought that I was exaggerating. And of course, I absolutely never exaggerate. But one day she was in her clinic and she had a patient, and it was a lady, and she said, she asked about her husband, and she said, the knife went in. And she realized that I hadn't been exaggerating. Now, this way of putting it is significant, at least I thought it was significant, because it suggested that the perpetrator was, by his rather peculiar locution, distancing himself from his own act and from his responsibility for it. And he was turning it into some kind of natural event, rather like an eruption of Vesuvius, for example, rather than a motivated, willed action with human intention behind it. But of course, it's not only murderers who use this mental device. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I doubt that there is anyone in this room who has never resorted to it. And certainly the human mind rarely displays its flexibility so brilliantly as when it is finding excuses for bad behavior, or rationalizations for having done what ought not to have been done. And even the dullest person who has never had an original idea in his life instantly becomes wonderfully inventive the moment he is justly accused of having done something that he ought not to have done. This is an important, if not necessarily creditable fact or aspect of human psychology and nature that is surely available to anybody who will either pay attention to or think about the words and acts of others, or to what Dr. Johnson called the motions of his own mind. And it's my contention that honest attention to the words and deeds of others and to our own thoughts and emotions reveals to us infinitely more about the human condition than the formal study of psychology has ever done or will ever do. And in fact, it's my contention in the book that psychological theory, whether it be psychoanalytical, behaviorist, Darwinist, or neurochemical, whatever it is, certainly any theory that claims to explain all or a very large part of our human existence and experience actually creates a barrier to human self-understanding rather than an advancement of it, insofar as it encourages people to think of both themselves and others as objects rather than as subjects. And this inevitably leads to an increase in intellectual and moral dishonesty and evasion, because try as we might, we cannot experience ourselves as objects rather than as subjects. So there's inevitably a tension that is created. As I said, this is the thesis of my book, which has been very kindly published by Encounter Books. And I don't want to praise myself, but I think I can say, without fear of being accused either of false modesty or boastfulness, that it is very short. So that even if what it says is mistaken, completely mistaken, at least it doesn't claim too much of anybody's time. Now, I think it's probably true to say that there is a general impression in the population that mankind, thanks to increased technical prowess, has made enormous and even accelerating advances in self-understanding in the last few decades, especially in the last 3 decades, shall we say. And of course, I don't want to deny the reality of technical advance or the value, for example, of drugs in some conditions, advances in neurosurgery and the like. But it seems to me that in important questions of human existence, how we should live, what is the purpose of our life, what is the good, what should we strive for, we are no more advanced than our predecessors, and it is quite probable that we shall never be more advanced than our predecessors for metaphysical reasons. But the fact that some questions are not susceptible to indubitable answers or technical answers does not mean that they cease to be questions, and important ones at that. It's the thesis of the book that over the last century or so, different schools of psychology have repeatedly claimed much more for themselves than are justified by their actual achievements, and that they have revealed little that adds to human understanding in the broad sense. We are inclined to accept the latest claims, at least for a time, because to us we find it an affront that we are unable to unravel our own mystery. When Hamlet says, "What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god," we feel that, therefore, like a god, we should be able to understand ourselves. But in fact, we do not understand Hamlet, let alone ourselves. And actually, I think that that is one possible explanation, or one possible interpretation of the play that Shakespeare is actually telling us. We do not understand ourselves, we cannot understand ourselves, we cannot understand others. So we tend to assume understanding, though we have it not. And to claim knowledge where there is actually ignorance is often a very harmful thing. Indeed, I think that there isn't even an understanding of what understanding would actually be. When a patient asks me, why do I behave as I do? And of course, they were always asking about their bad behavior, because nobody ever asks, why do I do what I do about their good behavior? I mean, nobody has ever asked, why do I help old ladies across the road, for example? I would ask them to give me an example of what would count as a satisfactory and complete explanation. And not one of them was ever able to give me such an example. Now, of course, there are certain types of explanation that do seem to us satisfactory. When I see a man, or at least in my youth, when I saw a man eating a sandwich and I assumed that it was because he was hungry. I no longer make this assumption because people are eating all the time, and I'm not sure that people can be hungry all the time. However, that's the kind of explanation that we do accept and we understand. In my hospital, I would see, for example, a man who became confused when he had a low level of sodium in his blood. And when that level was corrected, he became no longer confused. He returned to normality. And, of course, we would look no further for the cause of his confusion. We would look for the cause of the low sodium, but we wouldn't say we didn't understand why he was confused. And so we would say that a satisfactory explanation had been found. But this is far from a typical or common situation, and not too much should be made of it. But I think that we do exaggerate the potential for this kind of naturalistic explanation in settling the deepest questions of human existence. And I think that this leads to a certain shallowness, and you can hear it on buses, for example, when people are talking about themselves. They're talking about themselves as if they were objects, but in a very shallow way, and they are, if you like, self-obsessed without self-examination. And this kind of desire for an explanation alienates us from our own experience. I'm not going to illustrate the point by quoting or referring to the contents of the book, because I want you to buy it afterwards. And to quote it is actually to have read it. So, but I would prefer to refer to the fact that a book was recently sent me through the post by its publishers in the hope that I would make some reference to it or even review it. That in 360 pages sought to prove, with an immense and enormous machinery of academic references, that human beings, on the whole, are happier if they have some face-to-face and person-to-person contacts, and much happier if they do have them. Now, imagine someone going to Shakespeare and earnestly explaining to him the content of this book. Well, William, did you know that human beings need one another to be happy? I bet you didn't, because, you know, poor chap, you lived in the 16th century. Well, I don't think the bard would be bemused, because nothing really human bemused him, but he might have been amused. 2 lines of his own might have run through his head. Lord, what fools these mortals be. And, oh, brave new world that has such creatures in it. Now, I'm going to embark on a procedure that might strike you as slightly unfair, but of course fairness is rather dull, and in any case sometimes misses the point. I'm going to compare typical modern psychologizing with more literary psychology of an earlier period, and leave it to you to decide which you think actually is more important from the point of view of human self-understanding. An understanding of what might be called the human condition, which is a slightly vague term, but we know what it refers to, and words cannot be made to be more precise than their subject matter allows, because false precision is actually as hazardous as imprecision. Well, in the bookshop at the airport on my way to New York, I bought the first 2 books of psychology that I happened to see. There are always books in airports telling you how to be happy. There are 2 sections, there's happiness and wealth. And it's been the same for 50 years, so this suggests that they are not altogether successful, these books, from the point of view of their ostensible objects. Well, bear in mind that it is sometimes claimed that humanity has made tremendous advances in psychology, and that these have added to our self-awareness and understanding and so forth, which surely should have translated into an ability or knowledge of how actually to live. Well, I opened the first book at random, and it truly was at random, and it was on page 83, and my eyes fell on the following. Clarity is what a person's psychology is always endeavouring to return to. I don't think that's empirically true, actually, but anyway. Innate clarity and resilience are always shining a beacon. Even when a person seems hopelessly lost, you see, and here the writer adds emphasis, so we must assume that this is something very important, clarity isn't an achievement, it's a pre-existing condition. It's not something that you need to practice or work on. It's an expression of who you really are. Now, I hope that this is clear and that you'll find it useful, or at least that part of you that is the real you. Well, I opened the second book, and what do I find? Acceptance means understanding that things are, or are not, happening. Mindfulness involves accepting what's happened and what's happening right now. It involves feeling what you feel without trying to resist or control those feelings to whatever it is that is happening. And he doesn't add or not happening, because as we know, what doesn't happen actually arouses us almost as much as what happens. Anyway, I try to imagine what it is like to find this kind of drivel illuminating, but I'm not sufficiently a good psychologist to understand what state of mind you would be in to find that illuminating. And one of my many ideas of hell, I have no ideas about heaven, but I have many ideas of hell, is to wade through hundreds of pages of this stuff, though actually there are millions of pages of it. And it's published and it's bought, and actually it was claimed that these two books were bestsellers. And if, as I said, if you listen to people talking in buses about themselves, you will hear them repeating it, often with a little light neurochemistry thrown in, which almost always involves serotonin, either too much or too little, or anyway the wrong balance, or lithium, which many people think is a natural constituent of the human brain. Now, again, one might have thought that if psychology had truly illuminated our existence, some rumour of this fact might have reached the population to prevent the sale of such books and the use of such language. But there's no sign of this, and it seems to me we haven't progressed beyond Norman Vincent Peale or Dale Carnegie, let alone Shakespeare. And psychiatry, I don't think, is in much better shape. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association provides checklists of symptoms, and if a person has a certain number of those symptoms, he is regarded as having an illness, or at least for the most important purpose, which of course is insurance. But many of those symptoms are, I'm afraid, normal experiences of daily life, and I may tell you that I have personally examined between 10 and 15,000 people who have attempted suicide, and I've only ever heard them use the word unhappy 3 times out of thousands, and they all use the word depressed instead, and I think that's an important semantic shift. So it's hardly surprising that when you add up the prevalences given at the back of the DSM, that the average person has about 2.5 psychiatric conditions a year. In other words, we are all practically, all of us are psychiatrically ill, and none of us is normal, and in short, we all need a psychiatrist, if we can find a normal one, that is. Now, with this approach, you can, of course, make up diseases as you go along. If I take my own case, it could be said that I was suffering from book purchasing disorder. And the criterion for this disorder, and it's a very serious disease. Incidentally, there was a satirical pamphlet or poem written about the bibliomania back in the beginning of the 19th century, and it was called This Fatal Disease. Anyway, the criteria for this disorder are as follows. The sufferer must suffer from at least 3 of the following. He buys more books than 99% of the population, general population. He's statistically abnormal. Such purchases amount to a significant proportion of his discretionary income. He experiences difficulty in passing a bookstore without entering it. He experiences a rising tension which can be alleviated only by purchasing another book. He buys more books than he can possibly read. And he has either argued with his wife about the number of books in the house, or she has suggested a one-in, one-out policy, or she has banned the presence of books from a number of the rooms in his house. Well, I don't, I think, have to emphasize the absurdity of this procedure, which speaks for itself. But I'm afraid that this procedure actually is treated with superstitious awe And in fact, the diagnoses are mandated by law in some countries, and I believe so in this country, to be treated in the same way as very serious physical disorders. Well, let me now contrast all this with Dr. Johnson, though I could, of course, have picked out many other great writers to equal effect. But Johnson is particularly apt to remark on what no man would have thought on, and now appears scarcely possible for any man to miss. And he said this characteristically of someone not himself. In one of his brief essays, Johnson discusses what would now be called social phobia. Nothing more frequently causes bashfulness, says Dr. Johnson, than too high an opinion of our own importance. He doesn't say it so in every case, and he doesn't say it's always undesirable to be shy. When I look back on my own childhood, I was very shy as a child and as an adolescent. But I'm afraid I never lacked any sense of my own importance, however shy I was. So I recognise there was a truth in what Dr. Johnson says. He continues, "The bashful person considers that what he should say or do will never be forgotten, that renown or infamy are suspended upon every syllable, and that nothing ought to fall from him which will not bear the test of time." And he concludes, "He that considers how little he dwells on the condition of others will learn how little the attention of others is attracted to himself. The utmost that we can reasonably hope for is to fill a vacant hour with prattle and be forgotten." Now, this is not actually pessimistic. It's both realistic and consolatory, because it takes a great burden off our shoulders if we truly take that to heart. And over again, Dr. Johnson calls our attention to the complex relationship of our states of mind and to morality, without ever suggesting that there is a complete solution to our problems. Johnson says things that are obvious, and yet we have never thought of them. And by doing so, enables us, even if he does not compel us, to control ourselves. For example, he says, that as cruelty looks upon misery without partaking pain, so envy beholds increase of happiness without partaking joy. Now, I don't need to tell you, I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience, what part envy plays in the world, none at all in our psychology, of course. But Dr. Johnson is not so naive as to suppose that by simply enunciating this reality, a vice such as envy can be eliminated. In another context, he says, nothing is more unjust, however common, than to charge with hypocrisy him that expresses zeal for those virtues which he neglects to practice, since he may be sincerely convinced of the advantages of conquering his passions without yet having obtained the victory. And this surely is the experience of everyone in this room. But a clear enunciation of what envy is, and what Dr. Johnson says is pretty obvious in a way, but I don't, and you may tell me afterwards, this is how you thought of envy all along, I don't know. But once it's put into your mind, it may help you, if not to conquer it, at least to control it, because you know what it actually is. Johnson says nothing that any mind could not have thought for itself, even if that person has not thought of it. But everything he says has immediate and obvious application to our own lives. On another occasion, he says what is obviously true. A student may easily exhaust his life in comparing divines and moralists without any practical regard to morality or religion. He may be learning not to live, but to reason. Nowadays, I think he would have added psychology to that. And even if we, which does not and cannot teach us how to live, even if we have no idea how to live, it's not going to help us. Indeed, it serves as an obstacle, I believe, to living well, as it prevents honest reflection, or discourages, doesn't prevent, discourages the kind of honest reflection that Dr. Johnson constantly exhibits. It is, as Karl Kraus said of psychoanalysis, the disease it pretends to cure. And that, at any rate, is the drift of my little book. Thank you very much. I think if there are any questions, I mean, I hope that everything is clear. But yes.
Hello. Yep. Thank you very much for your lecture. That's very fascinating. So C.S. Lewis, in an essay titled "A Humanitarian Theory of Punishment," has a lot of the same themes from this. So I'm wondering, could you comment on? You've kind of talked about how in popular culture and in society we can be corrupted by not taking morality seriously enough to the extent to where we start to devalue human depravity and don't actually think about how we can be responsible for things. And can you comment on the other side of the coin to where, as Lewis points out, we can go to the other extreme and tend to keep those that we deem to be either psychologically deficient or criminally minded in a state to where they really can never change, and we use it as an excuse to try to socially engineer society or criminals or rehabilitation. Can you talk about if you think that's actually a problem now in our society?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that essay, because it's a very brilliant little essay. And actually, he doesn't say so directly, but the humanitarian theory of punishment is compatible both with the most absurd leniency and the most terrible cruelty. Because if you regard punishment as therapy, then obviously cutting off arms is therapy for certain kinds of behavior, or could be regarded as such. And we actually see this in we see the problem in the jurisprudence of Europe. Recently, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that several life sentences life meaning life, that prisoners will never be released, were against their fundamental human rights because it was cruel. And it was cruel because it offered them no hope of redemption or rehabilitation. And there were 3 R's. They were not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they were redemption. The other one was remorse. And this, I found this truly astonishing, that on a continent in which, within living memory, 50 million people had lost their lives violence, the judges could imagine no crime that was so terrible that it meant you should be excluded from society for the rest of your life, which is not, of course, the same as treating people cruelly, because there are reasons why you shouldn't treat people cruelly. And if we see Breivik, the case of Breivik, you of course know about the case of Breivik, the man who shot 69 people on the island of Utøya, I don't know how it's pronounced, in Norway. And under Norwegian law, the maximum sentence that anybody can be given is 21 years. And he killed 77 people in total. And there were Norwegians who quite reasonably thought that it should be 21 years consecutively for each of the 77 whom he killed, and which I would say is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Now, the Norwegian law says, however, that after 21 years, if the person is deemed still to be dangerous, he can be kept in for another 5 years, and after another 5 years, he can be kept in for another 5 years, and so on ad infinitum. Now, this is fundamentally against the rule of law, because a man is being punished not for what he has done, but for what he might do. And for what he might do is intrinsically unknowable. And I am actually completely opposed to that kind of thing. But that shows the influence of psychological theory on, or psychological kinds of thinking anyway, as well as a certain moral theory, on jurisprudence, which actually leads to something that is very arbitrary. I used to see it in my prison. I would be asked to speculate on whether someone was still dangerous, and I refused to do so. I say, you know, and in my opinion, the person that I was speculating about should have been given a sentence. He should have served that sentence. And if the sentence was inadequate, well, then the sentencing policy should be changed. But you shouldn't ask someone like me to really arbitrarily to decide on a person's fate. I don't know whether that answers your question. There's a gentleman in the front.
Hi, I'm Matt Appleman from the Heritage Foundation. What is the number one takeaway that you want people? What is the takeaway you want people to have after reading this book?
Exercise judgment as to and accept that life is never going to be wholly satisfactory. And don't expect satisfaction out of airport psychology books, I suppose. But I don't actually, I don't go quite so far as to say that psychiatry can never help. But I don't think psychiatrists exercise much judgment as to when it can help and when it can't help, for obvious reasons. I think the gentleman there put his hand.
Ted Berman with the Heritage Foundation. Is there anything special about psychology, or is it simply a case study in the broader deficiencies of modern social science?
Well, I think it's a particular example of it. I mean, I certainly think that there are the same tendencies in criminology and sociology, for example. But in a way, it goes deeper because I think there are metaphysical questions. Now, I'm not a philosopher and I'm not a metaphysician. And no doubt the Churchlands, for example, would disagree with me when I say that there are metaphysical reasons for supposing that science is never going to solve all human problems or even explain everything about human beings. And that I say that without having any explanation myself of everything. Now, they are probably, because of well, no, perhaps I shouldn't say this. They're professional metaphysicians, and I'm not a professional metaphysician. And so, no doubt, there might be, perhaps in this audience, as a metaphysician who would dispute what I say. But I think that if there are such metaphysical reasons why psychology will never explain as much as it sets out to explain, then it's harmful to think that it will. Which is not to say that that there's nothing it can say, but I think there is yes, I think there is a commonality with say criminology, which often seems to treat people as objects rather than subjects. And I must say, I've never come across a criminal who didn't have contempt for criminology. It's a lady in the back.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us today. I am curious as to your operating definition of morality itself. Not only where it comes from, but perhaps how we could reinvigorate society today with it.
Well, Now, I'm not sufficiently a moral metaphysician to be able to give you a cast-iron metaphysics of morality. But I would say that I don't think people can actually, it's impossible for people not to make moral judgments. And I don't think it's possible for them not to make aesthetic judgments either. And the pretense that you can go through life without making a moral judgment is false. And in fact, the idea that you should do so is itself a moral judgment. Now, I don't have a fully fledged theory of morality, because none that I've ever heard of satisfied me or seemed to be watertight. Maybe someone here, does anyone here have a watertight metaphysics of morals? If so, I would like to hear it. But nevertheless, I think there are things that one can say which most people will agree with. One of the heartening things in the prison in which I worked was that when I talked to prisoners in moral terms, they all understood what I was talking about, with the exception of a few extremely dangerous and very strange people. But they were relatively few. And it's a very peculiar thing. You can almost feel that they're different in some way. But otherwise, people understood, actually, if it was pointed out to them. You could have some kind of dialogue with people, and in practice, you get some kind of agreement. The point is, let me give you an example, a small example. I presume I can use bad language. Can I use bad language here if it's a reported speech? And I say, you'd be a bit surprised if I said that, wouldn't you? And they said yes. And so I said, well, we're equal. You don't use that language to me, and I don't use that language to you. It's as simple as that. And they would stop. And I had no means of enforcing my request. I mean, I couldn't refuse to treat them if they continued to use bad language. But they did stop using bad language, and I would imagine I was the first person who had ever asked them to do so. So, but I can't, if you ask me to provide a Cartesian point from which it indubitably followed that people should not use that language to doctors, I'm afraid I couldn't give it to you. But nevertheless, there seems to be some kind of agreement that this is so.
I just wanted to ask you about just the idea of a mental disease overall. I mean, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, like this Germanwings pilot who crashed into a mountain.
Yes.
He's got some sort of disease, something's wrong with him. Is that language in and of itself kind of within this idea that we can just scientifically treat this the way we would treat a cut on the skin? I mean, that's just, if you could explore that topic.
Well, I mean, Andreas Lubitz, when that happened and it was revealed that he had flown the plane into the Alps, I thought the most likely explanation was that he had what the French call a chagrin d'amour. He had had some kind of difficulty with his girlfriend, that he was probably a narcissistic person. He couldn't stand the wound, and he didn't want to kill. His desire to kill others might have come from some desire for revenge, including making whoever it was who had upset him feel guilty, because he might have said, "I'll show you." In fact, there is a report that he did say that, but I don't know whether it's been confirmed. But at any rate, he seemed, I don't think he was a depressed man. I think he was an angry and embittered man. There is an intrinsic difficulty about psychiatric diagnosis, which one must admit. There are conditions. I used to have a discussion with Thomas Sass about this, and I'll give you an anecdote about my disagreement with Thomas Sass. Anyway, and that is that it does seem to me that something like mania, for example, exists and is a disease in the most banal sense of the word, that it's a real disease. But there's almost no biological distinction between that and various degrees of elation, for example, over a period of time. So there is an intrinsic tendency for these diagnoses, which at one time were rare, to become more and more and more common. And that, as I said, it happened. I think melancholia really exists and is a real disease. Unfortunately, the criteria become looser and looser and looser, so that everyone gets 10% of the population of this country is on antidepressants. And I had a disagreement with Thomas Sass about this, because he said that where there is no physical or physiological abnormality, you cannot designate something a disease. And any attempt to treat it as such is, and certainly compulsorily, is oppressive. And I had dinner with a friend of his, with him there, and he wanted us to discuss this. And it so happened I'd been on duty in the prison the night before. And I had a case in which I was called into the prison. There was a man, stark naked, who was trying to screw himself into the light socket, having first eaten the light. And and this is the kind of thing that sometimes happens. And he was stark naked. He was talking incomprehensible. You couldn't understand what he was saying. You couldn't take a history from him. You couldn't do any tests on him, and so on and so forth. But obviously what he was doing was very dangerous. And so I sedated him, and the next day he was perfectly all right. And the most likely explanation is that he had taken drugs of some description or other, although I never proved it. And I asked Sass what he would do in that situation. Would he stick to his view that if there wasn't a established physical cause, you couldn't treat someone against his will, because of course this injection was against his will? And he just said, I shouldn't have been there because I was part of the oppressive apparatus of the state. I said, well, does that mean that prisoners shouldn't get medical attention? But anyway, this proves, to my mind, the difficulty of the difficulty in the real world of that situation, and that's why people must constantly exercise judgment. And I think that judgment is not very well exercised. But of course, if you exercise judgment, you're often, or at least sometimes, going to be wrong. And so people want to have some kind of, if you like, checklist which will show them that they're not wrong. The system of diagnosis is a kind of manifestation of anxiety that one will make mistaken judgments. So in order to avoid occasional mistaken judgments, one makes massive mistaken judgments on a huge scale. For example, in this country, one of the great medical scandals is that 16,000 people are dying from opioid poisoning a year. And it's gone up by something like 400% in 10 years or something like that. And 100,000 people have been killed by opioid prescriptions, perfectly legal ones, over the last, well, in this century. And in my view, in the vast majority of those cases, those drugs should never have been prescribed in the first place. But there's been a change in attitude. The doctor shouldn't make his judgment. He should just take what the patient says and act accordingly. So if the patient says, I've got this terrible pain, that's it. He prescribes. He doesn't go much further into it, with the result of 16,000, at the moment, 16,000 people a year are dying of overdoses of these drugs. And I don't know whether, I haven't followed it enough. Has this created a big scandal in the United States? I don't know. Yes? No? No. But I think part of the problem is the failure of doctors to exercise proper discrimination, and also, of course, there's a culture in which doctors are there to give their patients just what they want, not what the doctor thinks is right. And the patient won't accept. If the doctor says, "I don't think that's right for you," the patient won't accept it. It's certainly true in England, where many doctors have been assaulted because of this, of refusal. So, I don't know whether that answers your question. Sorry.
You raise your hand first. A hallmark of the scientific method is posing a hypothesis and then subjecting it to an empirical test.
Yeah.
And I may be very uninformed, but it seems to me that in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, and there's various competing methods, Freudian, analytical, and what have you, there's a distinct lack of attempts to verify the effectiveness or falsify the effectiveness of various means of treating patients once you get beyond just describing some syndrome. And I was curious what your thoughts were on that aspect of psychiatry and psychology.
Well, I don't think it's quite fair to say that there haven't been these attempts. But if what I'm saying is true, the very attempt is not actually, cannot be made in many cases. Because, for example, expectations, culture, and so on make so big a difference to any potential results that the interpretation of the results becomes very difficult. So we were talking about this just before I came in. Supposing I think of an experiment. I get 100 volunteers. Now, the very fact that they're volunteers may make a difference. The fact that I've gone into this particular place and got those volunteers means that anything that I find is not generalizable to the whole of humanity in all times and in all places. And that's intrinsic. That is an intrinsic difficulty of the reflexiveness of our mentality, because our mentality changes with circumstances. So we will not find eternal verities about the kind of things that people do experiments on. With regard to testing of drugs, for example, it wouldn't be true that people haven't made hypotheses and tested them, but they often haven't reported them very honestly, the results. But I think there's an intrinsic, if there really is a metaphysical problem here, then it can't be got round by better and more refined scientific method. But there might be people here who disagree with that.
Thank you. My name is Todd Wiggins. Good to meet you. I've enjoyed reading about you as well as, of course, hearing you. I have a question for you about the differences that you may perceive in the way the Americans think versus the way people from where you're born are thinking. Is there any criticisms that you have for Americans that you'd like to provide us with now that you have the opportunity?
Well, one of the criticisms is they're always asking me for criticisms. And always asking me for takeaway messages, and I don't have many takeaway messages. There are obviously great differences. Americans are optimists, more optimistic than Europeans, often unjustifiably so, and that's why. Dare I say it, I think pessimists have a better sense of humour than optimists. And that's why American literature is so pessimistic, actually, tragic. So tragedy plays so large a part in American literature, because if you live in an optimistic culture and you're not and things don't go well, it's even worse than if you live in a miserable culture where you expect to be miserable and where it's normal to be miserable, like Hungary, for example. I don't know whether that answers your question. I mean, but I wouldn't, you see, I wouldn't just take a sample of Americans, do a study on them, and assume it must apply to Austrians or to Koreans. And it's the seeking of that kind of universal explanation which I think is mistaken. In the front row.
Well, I'm going to ask you to make another criticism here. Now that I have you here, and I've read your previous books about the decline of culture as a whole. You talked about the underclass, but you also talked middle class, et cetera, single-parent families, all that sort of thing. And I've been just itching for a desire to ask you, where do you think all this is heading? If you were to guess, or if you can guess. I mean,
I think it's heading to more of the same. I saw that 48%, for example, of American children are now born out of what used to be called wedlock. In Britain, it's 52%, so we're in advance of you. And I'm afraid I can't see that as anything other than a social disaster, even though I'm not, if I were asked for the metaphysical justification of my feeling, I'd just say that I think that is so. But I don't have an apocalyptic vision. I just think that in many respects this will cause unpleasantness, that we will just muddle through, and those of us and it might lead to a sort of bigger and bigger separation of society into those who behave in that way and those who don't. I mean, it certainly has happened in Britain in my lifetime. I don't like that, but I don't. If you're asking, is there going to be a complete collapse? I don't think there's going to be a complete collapse. And one thing about America that I think is much better than Britain is that there's much more resistance to it and much more resilience in the society. There's absolutely no will. I mean, at least here there's a kind of critical mass of people who are at least thinking about these things, but in Britain there's no frankness about it at all. Ladies and gentlemen, one last question. Lady at the back there, we've reached 7 o'clock. So
We're just out of time.
Oh, are we?
So we'll have a reception just across the hallway here, but let's thank you.
Thank you.